Hey guys, this is Jan for Chess24. The European Club Cup is finished. Congratulations to the winners from Siberia. And still a while till the European Team Cup, the equivalent for country teams, begins. However, it's still not a super tournament free time. We have a small but fine super tournament going on in Bilbao. It features Vishy Anand, Anish Giri, Wesley So and Ding Liren. And the game we're gonna study in this video is the battle between the latter two, between the US number 3 Wesley So and the Chinese number 1 Ding Liren, who recently also climbed into the top 10. Wesley So with the white pieces, and let's see what happens. Wesley So had a rough year 2015. Well, some parts of it at least. He lost 3 games in a row in the Sinkfield Cup in St. Louis, the super tournament in the United States. And one of the more memorable ones was his white loss against Hikaru Nakamura in a sharp line of the King's Indian. Ding Liren, another big expert on the King's Indian, an opening that took him into the top 10 of the world, so maybe it's not as bad as I always say, even though I'll never really like it. However, Wesley So is not afraid to enter one of the most critical main lines once again. He follows his game against Hikaru Nakamura, d5, knight e7, knight to e1. Multi-purpose move, freeing the way for the pawn to go to f3. The knight could jump to d3 to support the c5 advance, and it's one of the sharpest lines that all of chess theory has to offer. Knight d7, bishop e3, this is still the game. So Nakamura as well, f3, f4, bishop f2, and g5. And we see very typical King's Indian play. Black is trying to pretty much checkmate white on the king side by preparing the g4 advance by all means necessary, while white is trying to break through on the queen side with the help of the move c5 to open the position up there and generate targets before he gets checkmated. In his game against Nakamura, So played the move knight to d3. This time he decides to deviate and he goes for another logical and well-known move, the move rook to c1, preparing for action on the c-file. Knight to g6 is always a part of Black's plans, and Wesley So goes for the immediate breakthrough c5. Now you might ask yourself, isn't this losing a pawn? And the answer is yes, it is. But there is method to the madness. This is a well-known pawn sacrifice. After knight takes c5, white goes b4. And one point is, this knight would love to retreat to d7, but it can't, because knight d7 would be met with knight to b5, when the pawn on c7 would drop, which is very bad news for black. Therefore the knight has to go to a6, which not only is a more passive square, knight on the rim is dim as we know, it also has the problem that this knight can't really influence the action on the king side. In an ideal world, black would love to have the knight on f6 supporting the g4 advance, but on a6 it's very far away from such operations. However, black did win a pawn, so this operation did come at a very stiff price, and the verdict, if this pawn sacrifice is good for white or not, is still pretty much out. It's been known for a while. There's some classic games, Piquet against Kasparov, and later a game Topalov against Rajabov and so on, but I'm not sure that people have concluded whether this is good or bad. Knight d3 was played by Wesley So. The alternative is knight to b5, which quite often can transpose after moves like bishop d7 or rook to f7, but So decides to defend his pawn on b4 first. h5, always part of black's plans to prepare the g4 advance. Now knight to b5, attacking the pawn on a7. However, I just mentioned could transpose after a move like bishop d7 or rook to f7. I'm not a big specialist on the King's Indian and this line, but I did check the excellent video series by our friend Robin van Kempen on Chess24, and he recommends in the connected ebook to just sacrifice his pawn on a7 and go for a setup like this. Play rook f7, bishop to f8, rook to g7, and prepare the advanced g5, g4, when he comes to the conclusion that black has his fair share of play. As I said, I lacked expertise to verify that, but it's certainly a very interesting idea to let this pawn go to gain some tempi for play on the king side. Ding Liren decides to keep it, and he goes for the move b6, which, well, on the plus side, obviously does defend the pawn on a7, but it also has its minuses, and the biggest one is that this knight on a6 becomes slightly loose. It's no longer protected by a pawn on b7, and this can become a problem in some lines. However, for now, it seems like it's a long way until this bishop can target this knight, for example. Therefore, Wesley So starts regrouping. Very typical maneuver, which you want to keep in mind if you want to play such lines with white. He goes for the move bishop e1, not only keeping an eye on the b4 pawn, but also preparing the move knight f2, which looks passive. As I mentioned, the battle is about this advanced g4 here, this breakthrough. And with the knight on f2, white has a lot of pieces stopping that. So it's a very well-known and effective defensive mechanism. Rook to f7, part of black's plans, bishop to d2, bishop to f6, hinting that this bishop wants to go to d8 to cover the weakness on c7 and free up the queen. Knight to f2, concluding the maneuver, queen to e8, clearing this square, and queen a4, starting the operation to lay eyes on the knight on a6, which, as I mentioned, lacks support by the pawn now. At the moment, this knight on b5 is still pinned, so there's no threats, but a move later, after bishop to d8, queen to a3, the pin is no longer in place, and ideas like knight takes d6 are starting to show up. Black can't really defend passively against this. If he went, for example, for knight to b8, he would already run into knight takes d6, followed by rook takes c8. And therefore, Liren decides to use the one drawback of the move queen a3, which is that the knight on b5 at this very moment is not protected by the queen anymore. And therefore, he goes for the move g4. After fg, hg, it turns out that white can't capture on g4, because then the knight on b5 would drop. Therefore, he has to do something else, and clearly Wesley So had anticipated this and planned the move knight to c3 with a double attack. He's threatening bishop takes a6 and bishop or knight takes g4. And it turns out that if black were to retreat his knight here, knight b8, after knight takes g4, white not only got rid of the main enemy, the pawn on g4, but also is very likely to gain the upper hand on the king side, because black really doesn't have a lot of pieces in that area. Maneuver like knight d1, knight f2, strengthening his grip on the g4 square. White would be doing pretty well. A more active idea, or it looks like a more active idea, would be the move g3, but once again the shortage of black pieces on the king side would tell. After it just takes a knight to h1, there's a double attack, knight takes g3 and bishop takes a6, with most likely the same outcome, that white would pick up the g-pawn and have a good position. Liren didn't like any of these options, so he decided to go for drastic measures. If this knight doesn't have a good retreat, might as well sacrifice it in order to keep his pawn mess on the king side alive. He goes for knight takes b4, queen takes b4. Now he only has 2 pawns for a piece, but he did gain the right to move, and he's trying to generate activity with the move f3. White doesn't want to take here and open his king's position, so he has to go bishop to b5. Liren removes the queen, goes to e7. I'm not sure about this move. I haven't analyzed deeply enough, but at first sight it looks like queen e7 might have been the wrong square for the queen, and the f8 square might have been better. Difference is that from f8 the queen in many lines can reach the square on h6, while from e7 could go to h4, but white meets both with g3, and after g3 it seems the queen might be better placed here. In fact, black could already create fire on board here with g3, knight to f4, which would have led to a complete mess. G takes f4 seems is no good because of queen h6, intending rook h7 with an attack down the h-file. And here it's not obvious who's better and why. It looks like black would be doing all right. There's more messy lines here. The computer gives bishop takes f4, e takes f4, and e5. With complete chaos. Don't ask me who's likely to come out on top here. The computer gives white a slight plus, but it always does this in the King's Indian. This would have led to a mess, and therefore I believe that queen to f8 might have been a better chance than queen to e7. But g3 is also the alternative rook h7, once again with ideas like knight f4 and queen h6. So this would have led to a very, very double-edged game. Liren chose the e7 square for his queen. White has to go g3 anyway, and rook to h7. more or less announcing his intention to create an attack on the h-file. After queen to c4, he goes rook h8 with the not very subtle but effective plan to go queen h7 followed by queen takes h2. However, white's not just gonna sit around and do nothing about it. He goes queen to c6, attacking the rook on a8, queen to h7, threatening checkmate, but it can be parried with h3, and now black has to worry about his rook. Gh3 just wouldn't work, queen a8, and there's no more threats on the king side remaining. So the rook has to move, it goes to b8, and Wesley so plays a classy move, or I think so. The move knight c to d1, intending to just bring more pieces to the critical area on the king side. As mentioned, he's never afraid of gh3. Not sure I mentioned that, but he never is, because that would sort of close this h-file for the black attackers, therefore ruin any black chances to give mate here after rook c3. Well, it would just be better. Instead, Liren chose the move a6, which contains a pretty devious trap. If white played a natural move, let's say bishop to a4, b5 and bishop to b3, bishop d7 and queen c2, queen takes a6 would lead to a similar outcome. All of a sudden, black would spring extremely active with the move knight to f4. And it turns out that black is winning here. There's no defense. After g takes f4, queen to h4, threatening queen g3 check, king h1, queen g3 anyway, threatening rook h3 and queen g2. There's just no defense. So probably that's what Liren based his hopes on, but it turns out that after a6, white has a very clever tactical defense against all these threats, and therefore I'm not sure about the value of the move a6. Another very interesting idea would have been to go knight f4 immediately, once again the sacrifice, but it seems like here white can defend as well with gf queen h4, same idea as we just saw, queen g3 and checkmate, king h1, queen g3. But now there is a defense, and it does involve giving up the queen. Queen a8 check, king g7, queen h8, king h8. Now this rook no longer exists to sacrifice itself on h3. Therefore white can now go rook g1, force the black queen back, and after queen h4, king h2, what's the expression? The dust has settled? Not sure, let's call it that. And it turns out that white has a lot of material for the black queen, and white gains or keeps the upper hand here. Therefore, knight f4 wasn't yet devastating, and that's why Liren went for a6, which, as I mentioned, looks pretty good, but he runs into a very strong idea. Queen e8 check, king to g7, which looks like it didn't really help white's cause. Queen is under attack, and so is the bishop. But there is a little trick. Queen takes d8, forcefully clearing the way towards the c7 pawn, which was the target of the white rook ever since it moved to c1. It does come at the price. You do lose a queen here. Rook takes d8, rook takes c7, and you don't win it back because black can block this check. But after bishop d7, rook takes d7, rook takes d7, bishop d7, once again it's time to take stock. And if we count, white has 1, 2, 3 minor pieces for the black queen. And in this position, where most of the action is likely to take place on the king side, the number of pieces is more important than the value of the pieces. And I believe that white has an almost decisive advantage here. Therefore, Liren has to look for improvements earlier. It's interesting that the computer doesn't really agree with this assessment. It still gives rough equality here after gh3, king h2. In fact, it gives a slight advantage to black, but I believe the computer is way off here and that this position is just winning for white long term because he can include all his pieces in the attack. There's really not that much that black can do about it. Liren does fight back, rook b7, bishop e6, knight f8, bishop f5, queen h5. The moves don't really matter that much here, the individual moves, because white will always manage to coordinate his pieces and then shift his attention towards attacking the black king. Knight to g4, knight to d7, bishop h6 check, Before he goes knight e3, the bishop occupies a more active position. King h8, knight e3. And it turns out, yeah, that the black queen, we see it's surrounded by all the white minor pieces, is not really effective here. White will pick up this pawn. There's not much to do about it. Rook to c7, he's trying to activate his rook along the c-file. But Wesley so goes for a very pragmatic solution of that problem, just gives up his powerful bishop for the knight, and thereby forces the rook off the c-file. Rook d7, and rook takes f3. And still, if you see this little computer bar, it still gives equality, which I find puzzling because I think this position is just totally winning for white. Now there's no longer time to go rook c7, which would run into rook f8, followed by knight f6 check, winning the queen. Therefore, to stop that, black has to go rook f7, offer the exchange of rooks. Wesley so agrees, but on his own terms. He goes rook to f5, saying if you want to exchange these rooks, you have to create me a passed pawn. Liren does that. He could have waited with queen g6, but then, for example, bishop f8. Targeting the d6 pawn would lead to the same outcome sooner or later. Therefore, Liren takes, pawn takes, and a new monster has been created, this f-pawn, which with the support of the white pieces, might very well become a queen. Queen f7, bishop g5, another good move, going for the ideal setup with the knight on h6, then forcing the pawn to f7. Liren does his very best to create some counterplay, goes b5 here, taking the c4 square away and preparing to build a passed pawn on the queen side, but it's too little too late. You will notice that the computer bar jumps after the move b5, but b5 is really not to blame. It is the position that's hopeless, and other moves would not have helped that cause. It just takes the computer a long time to understand that. b5, knight to h6, queen to f8, and now it turns out that this f-pawn can no longer be stopped. Liren tries to organize a bit of counterplay, first activating his king, and then his e-pawn, trying to distract the white pieces by pushing his own pawn. But it doesn't really help, and Wesley so has calculated the finish well. Goes f7, e3, bishop e7. Doesn't bother fighting against his e-pawn, allows it to queen, but it turns out that white also got the other black queen, or the old black queen, and the f7 pawn is still alive and shall give white one of these ladies as well. There's only a few spy checks left after bishop takes d6, threatening f8. Black gives a couple checks, but there is not a perpetual nearby. White just has too many pieces to cover the checks. Therefore, after queen e2 check, knight f3, checks have expired and Liren resigns. Could have fought on for a move or two, but the outcome is decided. For example, queen e7, the easiest is knight to f5. When queen f7 runs into the knight fork, knight g5, well, queen f8 only delays that by a move, bishop d6 and knight g5. So white wins. A very good game by Wesley So, and a very complicated game. It's not easy to say where black went wrong. I would point at two spots. One is the theoretical debate, really. In the opening, this move b6, I'm not sure is the right move. As I mentioned, Van Kempen recommends bishop d7, takes rook f7, tending bishop f8, rook g7 with a very complex game. So that's one option theoreticians should look into. And then later there was another key moment where the queen could have chosen the f8 square instead of the e7 square, which according to the computer doesn't fully equalize, but it looks like this gave a bit more options for counterplay. Still, good game for Wesley So, who becomes the sole leader of the Bilbao Masters after one round, because the game Anand against Giri did end in a draw. And he also wins an important game in the King's Indian. His results were so-so before this one, but he did strike back, did his homework after the painful loss against Nakamura, and came up with a very interesting line and was rewarded with a good win. If you want to follow the Bilbao Masters, I think I'll be doing live commentary on Chess24 starting with the second round. It does start at 4 p.m. Central European time, or whatever time we have in Germany right now. So if you want to check that out, I'll see you guys on Chess24 You can hear all my wise thoughts about the games, which will hopefully be exciting. Let's see who can catch some speed here, Vishy Anand, Anish Giri, Ding Liren, or the tournament leader, Wesley. So stay tuned and see you guys there. Thanks for watching this video. Bye bye.